I'm going to talk about the fall of Yugoslavia. Because of the recency of the conflict, the bloody fighting that ensued, and so many actors that were involved in the breakup of Yugoslavia, there are different interpretations and views on how to analyze and understand what happened. I'm fully aware of that. The purpose of this lecture is to give you a socioeconomic, political, and historical background, which you can use as a tool to understand and analyze those events and form your own opinion on what happened. So to understand the fall of Yugoslavia, we first need to understand Yugoslavia. And to understand Yugoslavia, we need to first talk about how Yugoslavia came into existence. So this workshop is going to start with pre-Yugoslavia. Countries in this area, so the area that is later became Yugoslavia and now consists of independent countries, used to be part of Ottoman Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the idea of unification of South Slavic people and creation of single state in which these people could be unified and could live existed since 17th century and was gaining momentum. The first time that this kind of unification of countries, South Slav countries, happened is in 1918 under the name of Kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, where there's a unification of Kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes with Kingdom of Serbia and Kingdom of Montenegro. And it was the Kingdom of Slovene, Croats, and Serbs that was established in 1918 was then renamed Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. Yugoslavia comes from two words. One is Slav, and obviously referring to the Slavic people, Slavs living here, and Yugo comes from word Yug, which means south. So the country of South Slavs. During the Second World War, Yugoslavia was invaded, and that happened in 1941, and it was invaded by Germans, Italians, and Hungarians. Independent state of Croatia was established as a Nazi satellite state in 1941. Between the years of 1941 and 1945, 500,000 people were murdered under that regime. Some were Jews and Roma, but mostly it was the Serb population. In that time, Croatia was ruled by Ustaše, which was a Croatian revolutionary movement that had a very strong military wing, and that was basically controlling the territory. So Croatia was part of the fascist Europe. There were two resistance movements in Yugoslavia. One was the communist partisans, and the second was the royalist Chetniks. Now, the royalist Chetniks were part of the government sponsored resistance, but ended up at times collaborating with the occupier and even fighting the partisans, which meant that after the war they lost a lot of legitimacy. The communist partisans were led by Josip Broz Tito, and they were the largest resistance group in occupied Western and Central Europe. By 1945, Yugoslavia was liberated, and they defeated the Nazis. As I said, because of their cooperation with the occupier, the Chetniks lost legitimacy, and Tito and in general the partisans got the hero status, and that also led to creation of Yugoslavia. So And this leads us to the second part, which is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was created um, firstly by elections in 1945, um, when only communist-led National Front was on the ballot, and people basically voted for it. In 1946, a constitution is written, and Yugoslavia is established. Um, the, the, the creation of Yugoslavia, or the formation of Yugoslavia, was such that there were 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces. The republics were Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, and the provinces were Kosovo and Vojvodina. Each of these autonomous, each of these republics had their own constitution, Supreme Court, Parliament, President, and the Prime Minister. Um, and each of these republics also obviously had um, their own identity, and a lot of times that identity was very much connected with the identity of the people that lived there. So there were Slovenes that lived in Slovenian Republic, Serbs that lived in Serbia, mostly Croats that lived in Croatia, and so on. Yugoslavia was a socialist state that was ruled by the Communist Party and had a very strong central government. I already mentioned Tito. Tito was the leader of Yugoslavia and somewhat of a unifying force, also because of the war hero status that he had. Um, there are a few things that are worth mentioning about Yugoslavia and creation of Yugoslavia. Firstly, after Yugoslavia was created, there was quite a substantial killing um, of collaborators with the fascist regime, um, which also later on led to tensions and resentments, and is still a part of discourse, the unlawful killings of the collaborators. Um, there were also there was also a suppression of political opponents of the regime that was happening throughout the existence of Yugoslavia. Secondly, Yugoslavia was um, built on the idea of brotherhood and unity. That was an official policy of interethnic relations. So obviously Yugoslavia was a country that brought together South Slavs, but these were different nations and different peoples. And the idea is that we should live together without um, nationalism, and should forget ethnic differences, and we should live as brothers in unity. And nationalism was actually prohibited. The idea was all groups are equal and should coexist, and for a long time in Yugoslavia, that was also a very strong unifying principle. All republics and provinces are equal and are together in this unity. Thirdly, what's worth mentioning is that Yugoslavia for years was an example of an economic success. In 60s and 70s, it was mentioned abroad and studied in United States and internationally as an economic success. Together with Japan, it was one of the countries that were seen as an example of successful economic development. For example, in Slovenia, there was a period of 25-year 100% employment, so full employment. So there was economic growth, loads of prosperity. Another thing that happened was another thing that was uh, that 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 happened was as a part of the socialist state was there was workers' participation both in ownership of factories and participation in management, or co-participation in management. So these are some things that um, that can show you what was happening in Yugoslavia and the sentiment. In Yugoslavia, after it was created, um, it was it had support from so after it was created in 1940, after it came in existence in 1946, in 1948, because of differences with Stalin and Tito, there was a split between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. Um, Tito criticized both blocs in the Cold War, so he was a critic of the capitalist and the communist um, blocs in the world at that time, and together with some other states, um, Yugoslavia established non-aligned movement in 1961, which was a very important movement in the world in the following years. So this is about Yugoslavia. The next thing I want to talk about is the start of the end. In 1980, Tito died, and already in 1974, the Yugoslav constitution, the new Yugoslav constitution, reduced the power of the central government and gave more autonomy to the republics and provinces. But Tito still managed to keep Yugoslavia strong, exactly because of the power and the unifying factor he was. After his death, um, there was a lack of a leadership under which all of Yugoslavia could be united, some say. Second thing that happened that can also be contributed to the start of the end is the economic crisis. In 1970s, Yugoslavia entered a disastrous economic situation because they were borrowing from the West because they wanted to fuel their economic growth by exporting to the West and to they funded the bigger production by borrowing from the West. But with the recession in the West that happened, Yugoslavia's exports were blocked, which meant that Yugoslavia suddenly had a debt problem, which led to it accepting an IMF loan. By 1990, because of economic crisis and IMF programs IMF programs that were implemented, 60,000 people were laid off, and 60,000 people that's out of 2.7 million workforce. Another 20% of the working people were not getting paid because that was one of the measures that the companies took to keep to stay alive, so to avoid bankruptcy. So economic crisis and suddenly lack of full employment, lack of prosperity also contributed to the disenchantment of the people by the idea of Yugoslavia. Um, Another thing that happened and which is very important, were the Kosovo protests in the province of Kosovo. Um, in 1987, there were tensions in Kosovo between the communist leadership and Serb nationalists. So Kosovo is a province that had majority of Albanian population and minority Serb population. Um, so Kosovo is important because not only it's the only province that doesn't have actually the only part of Yugoslavia that doesn't have Slavic people, um, but it's important because it was very important and it's still very important for Serbia. In 1939, King Lazar fought in the field of Kosovo to stop the advance of Islam. And culturally, politically, historically, Kosovo is very important for Serbia, and it's even now mentioned as the heart of Serbia, uh, as was the rhetoric when it was gaining independence. So, in this province, where you have majority of Albanian population, all of a sudden, you have communist leadership. As we said, each of the provinces or republics had communist leadership um, that was leading the country. So that leadership was in conflict with the Serb minority in Kosovo. Serbs, Serb nationalists were claiming that their rights weren't fully protected, that they were being oppressed, and so on. So, to appease the people and to solve the conflict, the Serbia sent Milosevic to talk to the protesters. Milosevic at the time was the right hand of Serb president Stambolic, um, and so he was upcoming, already established politician in the region. At the meeting in Kosovo, where Milosevic came to talk to the communist leadership and Serb nationalists, what happened is that while they were having a meeting and talking, there was fighting that broke out outside of the meeting, and it was fighting between the Serbs and the Albanian police. Um, so when Milosevic came out, what he saw is, and what he was told is that the Albanians or the Albanian police is fighting the Serbs. Now there are interpretations of who started those fights and how it was all started by the Serbs to fuel nationalism. But anyway, the Milosevic's reaction to that was um, he stated at that point that no one will fight you to the Serbs, so no one will harm you, and that led to that was broadcasted around Yugoslavia, and the sentiment fueled nationalism on all sides, but mostly in Serbs, um, as they felt that Serb population in Kosovo isn't doesn't have equal rights and they need to be protected. Later on, that actually led to ousting of the Serbian president. Milosevic took power, and it led to general growth of nationalism. Uh, Next thing that happened that led to the fall of Yugoslavia is with the conflict and growing nationalism that's happening. At the same time, Milosevic put in place something that he or the leadership called anti-bureaucratic move. So after the 74 constitution that gave greater autonomy to to republics, there was a move toward establishing in the other direction, so towards establishing a stronger, more central leadership, because that would give the regime and Serbs greater power over other republics and other parts of Yugoslavia. So, with series of anti-bureaucratic moves, Milosevic managed to reduce autonomy, especially of Kosovo and Vojvodina, so the autonomous provinces. And he actually managed, or the leadership managed to set Serb people in the leadership of both Kosovo and Vojvodina and Montenegro. Um, so all of this reduced autonomy, especially Kosovo Vojvodina, then leads to minor strike in Kosovo in '89. So the minor strikes, the idea was that they wanted to fight for greater autonomy. They wanted to fight against the move to reduce the power of Albanian people, but in general their right to rule themselves. The minor strikes were quite The minor strikes were quite prominent, and they were supported by Slovenia and Croatia, and especially because both Slovenia and Croatia felt that attack on Kosovar autonomy is a possible attack on autonomy of other republics, and they saw it as act of Serb nationalism that could possibly later on come and threaten them as well. Um, so when there was the idea of sending Yugoslav army to suppress the protests, both Croats and Slovenes opposed that. Um, Now, another thing is there was an extraordinary party congress on the future of Yugoslavia. So all of these things were happening at the same time. But there was a very important discussion that was happening between the leaders and in the leadership of the Communist Party and between the leaders of Republic, which was what's the future of Yugoslavia? How should we move on? And Serbia was fighting heavily for one person, one vote reform of the system. Now, why would that be right now? At that point, how the voting and decision making was happening is all republics and provinces had equal say. With one person, one vote, Serbia would get a much greater power because they had greater population than other parts of Yugoslavia. Uh, Slovenia and Croatia obviously opposed that and actually they were fighting for more power to the provinces, to the republics, and they were fighting for greater autonomy. So at the extraordinary Congress, Party Congress on the future of Yugoslavia, there was somewhat of a deadlock between what is that future and Serb stance on one hand and their supporters on one hand, and Croats and Slovenes on the other. And that led to Slovenes and Croats actually leaving the Party Congress because they felt there's no possibility to reach consensus and no respect for their opinions and their rights. Now that leads to multi-party elections in Yugoslavia. In 1990, the six republics organized their multi-party elections. Now, there are different reasons why that happened. One is for sure the general fall of communist regimes throughout Europe and international pressure. The other one is the internal conflicts and deadlocks within Yugoslavia that led to multi-party elections. In Slovenia and Croatia, actually, the communist parties decided to cede power peacefully and leave power to the newly elected parties. The newly elected parties, however, were had very much nationalistic tendencies and were again fighting and demanding greater autonomy. Um, in the example of Slovenia and Croatia, in the example of Serbia, Montenegro, and so on, the leadership was obviously demanding greater unity and a more centralized, stronger centralized government. Um, and the multi-party elections in the end led to the breakup of Yugoslavia. Very specifically, in Slovenia had a referendum of independence in December 1999, and they declared independence in June 25th. Croatia had a referendum and independence a bit later in May 91, but they declared independence on the same day as Slovenia on 25th of June 1991. Both of these referendums had high turnout and high support for the independence. So, for example, in the case of Slovenia, 88.5% people voted, and of those, 94.8 said yes to independence of Slovenia. And This now leads us to um, the next part, which were the conflicts that were caused by different republics trying to break out of Yugoslavia. So let's start with Slovenia. As I already said, Slovenia declares independence on 25th of June 1991. Um, Slovenia at that time organized spontaneous barricades for protection. It also wanted to make sure to secure its borders. However, already on the borders, the most of the soldiers that were there were already Slovene nationals. So what happened was they just changed their uniforms from the Yugoslav army to the Slovenian army. There was a war in Slovenia, but it was a short 10-day war without major casualties. Um, so reasons why Slovenian independence wasn't that bloody was, firstly, it was further away from Serbia and the central government than maybe Croatia. So there was Croatia between Slovenia and Serbia, which also contributed to stopping and blocking soldiers to Slovenia. And then the second thing is um, Slovenia was relatively homogeneous, so it didn't have um, huge Serb minorities, which might cause a backlash or a strong reaction from Serb or from within of Slovenia. Um, Another country that managed to get independence without conflict or huge conflict was Macedonia. Macedonia declared independence in 91, September 91, so a bit later than Slovenia and Croatia. It was actually the only country in those years that went out of Yugoslavia without actual conflict or resistance from Yugoslav leadership. Now, next country is Croatia, where there was much more where the conflict happened, and the breakup was much more messier. It was messier because Croatia had significant Serb minority living in the area, and that minority already early on, before the independence was declared, so in 90s where there were calls for independence, they were already uh, trying to establish their own republics um, as a Serb minority because they felt that they would not be safe under a Croat state. Now the sentiment comes or was fueled by Second World War, where Serbs were prosecuted by the Croats, and so a huge part of resistance against Croatian independence was that if Croatia gets independence, all the Serbs living in Croatia would get the same fate as it happened during the Second World War and the Ustashi regime. So Serbs tried to form, or the Croat Serbs living in Croatia tried to form enclaves in parts of Croatia, uh, and the and they were trying to separate from Croatia and remain in Yugoslavia or part of Serbia. And they actually had the backing of the Yugoslav army during the conflict. Now, so after Croatia declared independence, there was a 3 month moratorium imposed or asked for by the European communities, um, at the end of which, at the end of that, so the 3 month moratorium was in place um, as a as a as a time to resolve conflict peacefully and make sure that whatever and make sure that Croatia can gain independence peacefully, or whatever conflict there is can be resolved without a conflict. However, at the end of that 3 months moratorium, Serbs attacked by air main government building in Zagreb, and Croatia broke ties with Yugoslavia, and it led to basically conflict that escalated in following months. There was a ceasefire in 92, but effectively there were still hu- hu- significant parts of Croatia were still controlled by the Serbs, or Croatia had only uh, limited power over those parts. So effectively, even though there was ceasefire in 92, there was still a conflict in Croatia, in basically areas that were controlled by Serbs, where Croatia couldn't exercise its jurisdiction. Actually, there was up to 18% of Croatia's territory that was controlled by Croatian Serbs. So effectively, the ceasefire and the war ended in 95 with Operation Storm. That was battle. That was an operation by Croatia to restore its territory and take over control of its country. In the Operation Storm, which is even now considered a very successful military operation by Croatia, Croatia captured strategic positions and managed to take control of its territory. Now, number of Serb civilians that were killed in that conflict. Um, the interpretation of the number of Serb civilians that were killed in that conflict are different from 200, from Croatia claiming it was around 200 people, and Serbia claiming it was more than 1,000 civilians that were killed. But in any case, in the Operation Storm and the aftermath of Operation Storm, around 150,000 to 200,000 Serbs were displaced and victims of various crimes as a part of cleaning, as a part of as a part of Croatian action on liberating its territory and taking over the control. Actually, 3 generals in the Operation Storm were later put in front of ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, for the acts in Operation Storm, but they were later acquitted, so they weren't found guilty for war crimes. However, Croatia judiciary found more than 2,000 people guilty of various crimes connected to the aftermath of the Operation Storm. So in any case, it was a successful military operation in terms of Croatian liberation and Croatian independence and ending the war and stalemate that was happening in this in the country, but it had very serious negative consequences, and it basically hugely reduced Serb population in Croatia. The next country that had a very bloody separation was Bosnia and Herzegovina. The reason why Bosnia and Herzegovina was so bloody and their breakup from Yugoslavia was so bloody is because it's a multi-ethnic country. In Bosnia, there was 44% of Muslim Bosniaks living, but there was also 31% of Orthodox Serbs living and 70% of Catholic Croats living. So the division was huge both in terms of nationalism and religious identities. And those for sure fueled conflict that later happened. So Bosnia had referendum for independence in 1992, and they declared that independence the same year, even though the Bosnian Serbs boycotted the referendum. Now, the Declaration of Independence, again, spurred resistance by the Bosnian Serbs. So the Serbs living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and their resistance was again supported by by Milosevic and Yugoslav army. Again, the idea was that they need to secure Serb population and protect Serb population in the country, and protect Serb territory, which was which again protect Serb territory in Bosnia and make sure that it's not taken away from the Serb people and it remains part of Yugoslavia. And all of this created, all of this led to war breaking out. There was a alleged plan in that year, in 93, between Milosevic and Tudjman to split Bosnia and Herzegovina between themselves, so to prevent fighting between Serbia and Croatia, and by that give them greater chance of victory. But that in the end didn't happen. There was an international recognition of Bosnia that forced Yugoslav military to withdraw from Bosnia because they didn't have the right to stay there. However, what mostly happened was that a lot of soldiers just changed uniforms and stayed in Bosnia. And in any case, the Serb resistance was armed and financed to a great extent by Milosevic and by Serbs in Serbia. Because of their strong military backing, their military, they had quite some military success. At some point, 70% of the Bosnia and Herzegovina territory was controlled by the Serbs, by Republika Srpska, so the Serbs in Bosnia. And there was fighting by all three sides, so by Croats, Serbs, and Bosnians. And there were war crimes committed by all sides. The biggest war crime, and the most the worst crime that happened and the most prominent was Srebrenica, which was declared genocide by ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, where more than 8,000 Bosniaks were killed. And it was also controversial and prominent, Srebrenica, because it showed UN's inability, UN's peacekeeping forces' inability to protect civilians. The genocide in Srebrenica and general killings, but specifically the genocide that happened, triggered NATO bombing in 1995. NATO bombing was targeting Republika Srpska, and together with the ground offensive by Bosnian forces and Croat forces, which at that point were already cooperating and fighting together against the Serbs, led to signing of the peace agreement in 1995. So the peace agreement, or the Dayton Agreement that was signed in 95, stopped the fighting in Bosnia and created the present-day structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, specifically, why Bosnia was problematic and why there needed to be an agreement on the future of Bosnia was because, as I already said before, there were different nations, different nationalities, and different religions living together in this country. So they created basically this federation that consists of two entities. One is the Republika Srpska, where majority Serbs live, and the other one is Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they together with district of Brčko form today's Bosnia and Herzegovina. Presidency is shared by the three ethnic groups, so Croats, Serbs, and Bosnians, and they rotate as who chairs the presidency. Now, de facto greatest power in Bosnia and Herzegovina has the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is also a position that was created by the Dayton Agreement, which is basically a position of a person who oversees the implementation of peace and makes and oversees stability in Bosnia. This is an international observer. So all high representatives for Bosnia and Herzegovina so far were from European Union, and that person has the power to bypass the parliament or overthrow laws which spurs constantly some controversy on the democratic element of the position and the legitimacy of the position. I think it's worth noting that there's still very much tensions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's a lot of resentment that was caused by the war and basically people having their closest people killed by their neighbors and by people who still live very close in the same country as they. Obviously, war further triggered even geographical separation of the three groups in the country. But even today, there's still calls and wishes and demands by Republika Srpska, so Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for independence, for separation from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which basically would again, should those claims become stronger and should the separation actually happen, it could again reopen old wounds and lead to conflict possibly. Overall, in the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina and their breakout from Yugoslavia, 100,000 people were killed and 20,000 to 50,000 women were raped and 2.2 million people were displaced. And this makes the conflict the most devastating conflict in Europe since Second World War. The next country I want to talk about is Kosovo. So while all this fighting was happening in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo had, because of Milosevic's moves, limited autonomy and reduced independence in that time. In 1991, KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army, was created, and it was Kosovo Liberation Army was basically a militia group that was fighting against Yugoslav leadership and was fighting for greater autonomy, independence, rights of Kosovo. And it was active throughout the 90s and even later. KLA was considered a terrorist group by a lot of even international observers and countries around the world because of their activities and the way they were operating. The activities of KLA prompted military reaction and military confrontation by Yugoslavia or by Serbs in 1998 to 99. So this is already after after Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina are independent. So the military confrontation had military reaction from Serbs, obviously led to casualties. There was a lot of especially displaced people. I think around 250,000 people were displaced in the military confrontations in 1998 to 99. Um, Especially what 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 the sentiment in Europe was that they didn't want to repeat another Srebrenica. They wanted to avoid massacre at any cost, and with the general negative sentiment against the Serbs, um, Europe was very skeptical regarding fighting that was happening in Kosovo and the Yugoslav army fighting Kosovars. The displaced people, the killings, but especially one specific massacre, the Račak massacre that killed, where Serbs killed several farmers on fields, um, triggered international response and military intervention. So all of this led to NATO action in 1999, and this was NATO action against Serbia, both in Kosovo and against Serbia by military actions, by military attacks, air attacks in around Serbia, around Yugoslavia at that point. Um, Military air attacks by NATO led to bombing of both military strongholds, military positions, but also objects that were used by civilians as well. For example, there were radio stations, media stations attacked, parliament, um, Chinese embassy in Belgrade was by mistake attacked, by mistake bombed, and so on. The controversy with the bombing was also because it wasn't authorized by the Security Council. But in any case, the the boycotting of Serbia, the economic crisis in Serbia, and the military attacks in Serbia in 1991 led in 2000 led to overthrow of Milosevic, and subsequently led to peace agreement uh, in regards to Kosovo. Um, when the peace agreement was finally signed in Kosovo, there was a NATO-led peacekeeping force sent to Kosovo, and province um, was administered by the UN. So UN administration came in and basically took over um, administration of the country, of the province at that point, because it was still part of Yugoslavia. And actually, this UN administration and UN presence continues even now, even after independence of Kosovo in 2008. Uh, so the last thing that the last thing that remains, and the last thing basically that we skipped is it's important to understand that till 2003 um, there was a country called Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. In 2003, that country was then renamed into Serbia and Montenegro. And in 2006, Montenegro finally splits away from Serbia and becomes an independent country. And as I said already, in 2008, Kosovo splits away from Serbia. This is the current political constellation in the region. And this is how the breakup of Yugoslavia happens. Um, Maybe two last things that are worth mentioning is that the conflict in Yugoslavia triggered creation of ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, in 1993. It was international tribunal to prosecute war crimes that happened in the area. It is actually now closing, ending its work, with last cases slowly ending or being moved to other courts. Um, the question of justice and reconciliation that was brought by ICTY is open. Um, I think there are different views on that, and I think there is no consensus whether trying war crimes outside of Yugoslavia brought more justice and more reconciliation. I think what's important is that there is still a lot of resentment and a lot of ethnic tensions in the region. There is still a lot of countries that are unstable or even administered by international organizations. Another thing that's happening in the area is the European Union. So Slovenia and Croatia already joined the European Union, and there are talks of, and other countries are considering or are already negotiating their entrance in the EU, which might again cause changes in power play or the stability of the region. I'm going to talk about the fall of Yugoslavia. Because of the recency of the conflict, the bloody fighting that ensued, and so many actors that were involved in the breakup of Yugoslavia, there are different interpretations and views on how to analyze and understand what happened. I'm fully aware of that. The purpose of this lecture is to give you a socioeconomic, political, and historical background, which you can use as a tool to understand and analyze those events and form your own opinion on what happened. So to understand the fall of Yugoslavia, we first need to understand Yugoslavia. And to understand Yugoslavia, we need to first talk about how Yugoslavia came into existence. So this workshop is going to start with pre-Yugoslavia. Countries in this area, so the area that is later became Yugoslavia and now consists of independent countries, used to be part of Ottoman Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the idea of unification of South Slavic people and creation of single state in which these people could be unified and could live existed since 17th century and was gaining momentum. The first time that this kind of unification of countries, South Slav countries, happened is in 1918 under the name of Kingdom of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, where there's a... So Croatia was part of the fascist Europe. There were two resistance movements in Yugoslavia. One was the communist partisans, and the second was the royalist Chetniks. Now, the royalist Chetniks were part of the government sponsored resistance, but ended up at times collaborating with the occupier and even fighting the partisans, which meant that after the war they lost a lot of legitimacy. The communist partisans were led by Josip Broz Tito, and they were the largest resistance group in occupied Western and Central Europe. By 1945, Yugoslavia was liberated, and they defeated the Nazis. As I said, because of their cooperation with the occupier, the Chetniks lost legitimacy, and Tito and in general the partisans got the hero status, and that also led to creation of Yugoslavia. So, and this leads us to the second part, which is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was created firstly by elections in 1945, the unification of Kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes with Kingdom of Serbia and Kingdom of Montenegro. And it was so the Kingdom of Slovene, Croats, and Serbs that was established in 1918 was then renamed Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. Yugoslavia comes from two words. One is Slav, and obviously referring to the Slavic people, Slavs living here, and Yugo comes from word Yug, which means south. So the country of South Slavs. Um, During the Second World War, Yugoslavia was invaded, um, uh, and that happened in 1941, and it was invaded by Germans, Italians, and Hungarians. Independent state of Croatia was established as a Nazi satellite state in 1941. Between the years of 1941 and 1945, 500,000 people were murdered under that regime. Some were Jews and Roma, but mostly it was the Serb population. In that time, Croatia was ruled by Ustaše, which was a Croatian revolutionary movement that had a very strong military wing, um, and that was basically controlling the territory. Um, when only communist-led National Front was on the ballot, and people basically voted for it. In 1946, a constitution is written and Yugoslavia is established. Um, the, the, the creation of Yugoslavia, or the formation of Yugoslavia, was such that there were 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces. The republics were Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, and the provinces were Kosovo and Vojvodina. Each of these autonomous, each of these republics had their own constitution, Supreme Court, Parliament, President, and the Prime Minister. Um, and each of these republics also obviously had their own identity, and a lot of times that identity was very much connected with the identity of the people that lived there. So there were Slovenes that lived in Slovenian Republic, Serbs that lived in Serbia, mostly Croats that lived in Croatia, and so on. Yugoslavia was a socialist state that was ruled by the Communist Party and had a very strong central government. I already mentioned Tito. Tito was the leader of Yugoslavia and somewhat of a unifying force, also because of the war hero status that he had. Um, there are a few things that are worth mentioning about Yugoslavia and creation of Yugoslavia. Firstly, after Yugoslavia was created, there was quite a substantial killing of collaborators with the fascist regime, um, which also later on led to tensions and resentments, and is still a part of discourse, the unlawful killings of the collaborators. Um, there were also there was also a suppression of political opponents of the regime that was happening throughout the existence of Yugoslavia. Secondly, Yugoslavia was um, built on the idea of brotherhood and unity. That was an official policy of inter-ethnic relations. So obviously Yugoslavia was a country that brought together South Slavs, but these were different nations and different peoples, and the idea is that we should live together without um, nationalism, and should forget ethnic differences, and we should live as brothers in unity. And nationalism was actually prohibited. The idea was all groups are equal and should coexist, and for a long time in Yugoslavia,